Welcome to Blackstone Intelligence with your host, Jake Morphonios.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome everyone to the Blackstone Intelligence Report podcast. I'm your host, Jake Morphonios. Today we're going to be talking about the assassination of Iran's top nuclear scientist, and specifically what impact that killing may have on diplomatic relations between the United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iranian scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was born in 1958. He served as a brigadier general in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and he worked as both a physics professor at a university and as the top nuclear scientist in the country. In the mid-2000s, the United Nations Security Council voted to freeze his assets due to his work on Iran's alleged nuclear arms program. About a decade later, Fakhrizadeh established the Organization of Defensive Innovation and Research, which conducted research into nuclear weapons development. In November, about the middle of the month, I published my analysis of what I saw as a notable spike in coordinated anti-Iranian propaganda that was being simultaneously pushed by media in Israel, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the United Kingdom. And I indicated then that this was a telltale sign of an impending and likely dramatic action to be taken against Iran. So it came as no surprise to my audiences that such an event did take place about a week later. On November 27th, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was murdered in a high-profile assassination operation. Iran has blamed Israel for the murder, a charge that, of course, Israel disputes, though such denials are typical in the immediate aftermath of Mossad assassination operations. Iran's president, Hassan Rouhani, has promised retaliation at a time, place, and manner of Iran's choosing. However, complicating the potential response is the underlying hope by some in Iran for renewed diplomacy with America. There are a number of countries in the Middle East, namely Israel and Saudi Arabia, that do not want to see Iran brought back in from the cold. They want Iran to remain isolated on the international stage, and they are willing to take highly divisive and potentially explosive actions to try to prevent a return to that diplomacy. It isn't an exaggeration to suggest that this assassination was designed to obliterate conditions between the United States and Iran before President-elect Biden takes office, because Biden has made it clear on the campaign trail that it is his intent to restart diplomacy with Iran. His choice of Tony Blinken for Secretary of State demonstrates that even despite Blinken being a hardcore Zionist, Biden expects a return to some version of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the Iran nuclear deal. Biden has said that if Iran moves back into compliance with the deal, that America would rejoin it as well. He's also been critical of President Trump's abandonment of the deal and Trump's frequent provocations toward Iran. Here's what Biden said, quote, "President Trump has no strategy, it seems to me. He has no end game. His constant mistakes and poor decision-making have left the United States with a severely limited slate of options on how to move forward with Iran, and most of those options are now bad." Now, I would point out that what Biden says publicly for the sake of appearance is not necessarily in total alignment with what his team is likely discussing in private. The killing of Fakhrizadeh returns tensions between the United States and Iran to a boiling point. Now, while this may complicate a smooth transition or a return to the previous terms of the JCPOA agreement, what Trump has done with his act of belligerence on the way out the door has given Biden's team a perceived increased degree of leverage in future negotiations with Iran. And I say perceived. Now, Iran will respond in some way to the assassination of Fakhrizadeh. That's a given. Regardless of whether that response will be directly against U.S. interests, possibly including against its ally Israel, or whether retaliation is going to be against softer targets, such as U.S.-backed proxies in Iraq or Yemen, Syria, or elsewhere. The net result is the same. The Biden team will cite whatever Iranian action is taken as justification to demand that Iran make greater concessions than it otherwise would have had to do, as a form of pre-negotiation reconciliation. Of course, this is not at all how Iran is going to see the matter. Their position will be that as a sovereign nation, they are beholden to no other government. If a brazen act of murder is committed against Iran or its government, it reserves the right to respond with force without any regard for the feelings of the parties who initiated the conflict in the first place. And returning to the JCPOA deal is, in reality, far more complicated than just going back and putting a signature on the paper again. If Joe Biden were to just jump right back into the nuclear deal with no new demands, that would entail giving up a lot of the leverage that his team believes that they hold over Iran. We already know that Biden's team is expecting new concessions, even if they haven't been spelled out yet. For example, Jake Sullivan, Biden's choice for national security advisor, said this, quote, "Iran would also have to be prepared to advance good faith negotiations on follow-on agreements." The original JCPOA did not address certain areas of significance, at least not to any great extent. Things such as Iran's ballistic missile program, its support of militias and proxies throughout the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, in hot spots like Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, for example. That original deal, which was signed about 5 years ago, it had certain sunset clauses in it that are due to expire in 5 years from now and then in 10 years from now. And those sunset clauses, now that we are closer to them, 5 years has passed since the original signing, those clauses would be subjects of renegotiation expected by the Biden administration. We simply don't know at this point how much quote-unquote add-on material that Biden's team is really going to try and get Iran to address before the United States returns to the deal. Because for that matter, Biden could surprise us by returning to the deal as a sign of good faith himself, with some caveat that ongoing commitment to the deal by the United States would be contingent on measurable progress with Iran or on some of those other matters, such as Iran's ballistic missile program or their backing of the proxies in the Middle East. Adding to the potential complications in all of this is that Donald Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the nuclear deal taught Iran a very bitter lesson. One U.S. president cannot make a long-term promise on behalf of the United States of America. All of the hard effort, the concessions, the victories that are made through diplomatic efforts with one U.S. administration can be overturned in the blink of an eye by the subsequent administration. Now, this is kind of a new thing, because up until Trump withdrew from the deal, United States presidents typically had upheld agreements made by previous administrations as a matter of precedent. They understood that one of America's most valuable assets is our reputation, our word. Do we honor what we say we will do? Better for a president to not overturn his predecessor's significant diplomatic achievement because you don't like it, than to risk doing irreparable damage to the confidence of that other nation and the other nations observing in their confidence for our government to keep a promise that we've made. Not only has President Trump broken with that precedent, but he has carried out a scorched earth policy toward Iran that has made it infinitely more difficult for his successor to rebuild the bridge of diplomacy. So we have this stinging slap in Iran's face that has had a discernible impact inside of Iran on the attitudes of members of Iran's parliament. The old pragmatists, those who negotiated the original nuclear deal with the Obama administration, who did so despite the objections or in the face of the objections of the hardliners of that time, those people have been put on their heels. We told you that America couldn't be trusted, is what they keep hearing now from their hardline counterparts today. And we see that such hardliners are ascendant in Iran. The withdrawal from the Iran deal, the assassination of their beloved military hero, Qasem Soleimani, the man who, by the way, is responsible more than anyone else, if you had to pick one person, for the defeat of ISIS in the Middle East, and now the provocative assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh are evidences that reinforce the worldview of the hardliners that America and Israel are duplicitous and that we engage in treachery at every opportunity. So don't even bother trying to do business with us. Iran is going to be holding new presidential elections in June. And most people, at least currently, are expecting that one of these hardliners is going to win. Now, we have spoken for just a couple minutes in terms of U.S.-Iranian relations, but let's turn to Iranian attitudes toward Israel for a moment. For while President Trump would certainly have greenlit the assassination, the actual genesis, the planning, the orchestration, this was almost certainly an Israeli Mossad operation. According to the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, a man named Ali Shamkhani, Israel is behind the assassination. Now, there have been a few different versions of events that have emerged since he was killed on November 27th. In one version, Fakhrizadeh's car was stopped in a roadside ambush and surrounded by a hit squad of 12 gunmen who fled the scene afterward. But the most recent version of events, broadcast on Iranian state television networks, is that the killing was carried out using a remotely controlled vehicle and machine guns. Now, if that turns out to be true, then the satellite and other technologies that are necessary to carry out such a daring operation, high-tech operation, those are things most certainly available to the state of Israel. Israel has the means, they have the motive to conduct this kind of operation, and they also have a long history of stunning assassinations against high-level targets in Iran and Lebanon and elsewhere. And this includes things like speeding up on motorcycles next to cars carrying enemy targets out on the highway and attaching a magnetic bomb onto it and blowing it up as it is going down the highway. And then we have the fact that Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu singled out Fakhrizadeh in a made-for-TV propaganda special in 2018. Netanyahu spoke of some innocuous-sounding programs to which the nuclear scientist was supposedly connected, but that which Netanyahu claimed were actually linked to secret nuclear arms production. And Netanyahu, in that 2018 appearance, even repeated Fakhrizadeh's name, and he told the audience to remember that name. Not only does that kind of threat impugn Netanyahu in the court of public opinion, but if this matter were to be argued in an actual court of law, it could be presented as one piece of evidence toward his guilt, toward his involvement. For me, one of the more significant indicators, though, that this was an attack by Israel is because of what the attack itself intended to accomplish. When you understand the attack's purpose, it becomes easier to identify the perpetrator by determining which party had the motive to achieve that specific purpose. So first, the purpose of this assassination was not to stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Even up until President Trump withdrew from the deal, his own administration was publishing regular updates on Iranian nuclear facility inspections, which stated emphatically that Iran was not engaged in a nuclear weapons program. If the goal were to stop Iran from getting a bomb, then the Iran deal would not have been abandoned in the first place. Second point, Israel and the United States have known about Fakhrizadeh's efforts for well over a decade. In the past, he was the primary repository of nuclear knowledge in the country, but today, that knowledge is spread out among a lot of different nuclear scientists. So eliminating Fakhrizadeh has no significant impact on whether or not Iran can move forward toward nuclear arms development. So, what then is achieved by the assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, if not to stop Iran from building a nuclear bomb? The primary impediment to the profit-driven ambitions of oil corporations linked to Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the Middle East is Iran. The assassination of Fakhrizadeh is intended to inflame tensions, to incite an Iranian reprisal, which would be followed by a rapid escalation against Iran before Biden can take office. The goal is to lure Iran into a back and forth series of increasingly hostile exchanges. Such kinetic action might include Iranian Revolutionary Guard or proxy attacks against U.S. forces, most likely in Iraq, or action might be direct action against the State of Israel. There is, though, a line that the West believes exists that Iran cannot cross without significant consequence. Direct attacks on the United States, our forces in the Middle East, or Israeli forces, or on U.S. bases or embassies, that would essentially kill any hope of the United States returning to the JCPOA. If Iran can be lured into taking actions that eliminate the prospect of a return to the JCPOA, what happens? You have the collective sanctions that have been levied against Iran and that will continue to increase in this ongoing economic war. Those sanctions will never be lifted. Iran's currency will continue to devolve in value. The nation's GDP, much of it is derived from oil, will continue to see dramatic declines. The citizens will continue to experience worsening economic conditions, and throughout all of that, the green field of Iran will be rendered into a dry field, more ripe for the CIA and Mossad to drop a match and start a conflagration of civil uprising and unrest, which is their goal, to try and topple the government. The assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh is not about killing Iran's nuclear program. It is about killing the nation of Iran itself. In 1953, the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Iran, Operation Ajax, to allow for the return of a pro-Western puppet who then denationalized the oil and placed control of Iran's oil resources back into the hands of Western oil corporations and into the hands of the international bankers who invest and finance in those corporations. It should not go unnoticed that the control of oil, both the oil routes and the resources themselves, is at the center of the conflicts in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Azerbaijan, in Sudan, and nearly everywhere else that the United States and Israel are fomenting war. The Middle East is a geopolitical chess game for control of oil, and Iran is the most desirable piece on the board. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your Blackstone Intelligence Report for today. Thank you for listening. I hope that you'll join with me in being proponents of peace, because Blackstone Army members know that our goal is not to wage war, but to wage peace. We do that by softening our rhetoric, being civil in our discussions with others, not engaging in bigotry toward Arabs, Jews, or anyone else, and trying to let cooler heads prevail. And that is my hope. And if you can join me in that quest, then I would ask for your financial support. You can go sponsor me at patreon.com/endtimesnewsreport. Your support helps to finance these reports. And as a Blackstone Insider, if you donate $5 or more, you get access to exclusive content, videos, photos, and other things that I post only for Blackstone Insiders. Well, once again, thank you everyone for listening. God bless you all, and let's do what we can to help make this crazy world a little bit better place to live in.